Hello, my beautiful motorheads. Welcome to Feroz, where we inspire you to live fiercely. I'm your host, Annick Magac. I always love to hear how people got their first motorcycles. So I thought it would be fun to share how I got mine, because my first motorcycle, I saved it from being tied up into a tree and set on fire. Yep, true story. I thought it would be fun to share what my first motorcycle was and how I got it. I love hearing the story of other people and how they got their bikes and what they actually ended up getting. So if you feel inclined to share, please leave it in the comments and let me know, what was your first motorcycle? Before I dive into my story about how I got my motorcycle, I just want to remind you guys that you can buy Feroz merchandise. You can click below and shop the store, or go to liveferoz.com and purchase hoodies, t-shirts, cool hats, you name it. I saved my first bike from being tied up into a tree and set on fire. Now, I didn't realize I was saving this bike from this fate, or that the bike would also be saving me in many ways in life. At the time, I was working for an electromechanical engineering firm as an intern, and all the guys that I worked with had motorcycles in New York City. Now, I thought that growing up, I always did want a bike, and it was something that I inherently just wanted and knew that I would have at some point. But I always thought in my mind that I had to be this real grown-up adult to get a bike and have a house and, I don't know, a yard and a garage. It didn't seem to be a good idea to get a motorcycle when you're in your early 20s living in New York City. But, seeing these guys ride and race, I was like, man, if they can do it, I can do it. I'll figure it out. So I did, eventually, but not without cost first. So I made the decision to get the bike. I didn't have my license yet. I was kind of trying to figure it all out. And serendipitously, I went out to visit a friend for the 4th of July in New Jersey. The situation, if you can envision it, small town, New Jersey. This is not it's not Newark, New Jersey. We're talking the boonies, New Jersey. And they, like many small towns, have fireworks around the 4th of July. So we had to park in one area and walk from wherever we parked to the field that had the high school or whatever that had the fireworks. And as we were walking, many of you would be familiar with this situation. There were people already drinking and partying at their houses. And there was a house where there was a bunch of guys hanging out on the front porch. And there was a motorcycle in the front yard with a for sale sign. And I walked by it and I was like, it's a pretty cool bike. I was like, kind of like that. But I didn't know really what I was looking at. So I go to the fireworks, watch them. The whole time I'm at the fireworks, I'm thinking in my head, man, I really like that bike. That was kind of a cool bike. So we're walking back to the car, and I'm like, you know what? I tell my friend, I'm like, I want to go check out that bike. And I walk up to the house. Now, at this point, these guys had been drinking for several hours, and they were pretty lit and humored by this young, early 20s chick in a dress coming up and being like, hey, I'd really like to take a look at that motorcycle. And I'm like, I see the for sale sign. Can I sit on the bike? Who's selling it? And they're like, hold on one second. Monster. Legit. The guy's nickname was Monster. And he comes out and I'm like, can I sit on the bike? He's like, yeah, you can sit on the bike. I sit on the bike. I'm like, man, this thing is really cool and it seems to fit me. Right? which is, I hadn't sat on many motorcycles up to that point, but I was like, this fits pretty good. So the next day, I took Monster's info down, his phone number, because back in the day, that's what we did. We called on a phone, and I went back to work, and I said to the guys, right, all these motorheads, I was like, hey, I think I found my motorcycle, and they're like, okay, what is it? And they were thinking, a Honda Nighthawk or maybe a Honda Rebel, something like that. And I'm like, it's this Kawasaki, the guy said it was something like a 2-stroke triple. And they're like, what? I'm like, yeah, a 2-stroke triple. They're like, well, how big is it? I'm like, it's about this big. And they're like, no. They're like, Like, how big's the engine? I'm like, I don't know how big the engine is. They're like, oh, Annick. And to think we've come so far since then. They're like, if it's what we think it is, you can't get it. And I was like, what do you mean I can't get it? They're like, you're going to die on that. And I'm like, die on that? So there's a Kawasaki triple called the Widowmaker, and it's from the 70s. And it was called the Widowmaker for many reasons, but notoriously because it was a two-stroke triple. And the power band, I don't know, if any of you are familiar or not familiar with two strokes, the way the power comes on is that you've got to wind the engine out, hit high RPMs, and then the engine basically comes alive. And when it comes alive, it is like, hold on for dear life, because this thing is going to just totally take you for an awesome, fun ride. Now, if you're just starting off riding motorcycles, that might not be such a great idea. And if you were on the 70s Widowmaker, Kawasaki Widowmaker, it was really notorious for having bad brakes and being the fastest motorcycle of its time, right? Think like Kawasaki H2 now. So the Widowmaker was the 70s version of the Kawasaki H2. And actually, it wasn't H2. Yeah, it was the H2. So they were like, no, if it's what we think it is, you cannot get that motorcycle. And I was so bummed out because I was like, man, this thing is so cool. It's kind of like, it's got this like really beautiful orange paint job. And they're just like, orange, that's kind of weird. Because they're like, I don't remember that motorcycle coming in orange. So like a week later, one of those guys comes back to me and he's like, hey, Annick, I was thinking about, what that you were asking about that Kawasaki. And he goes, those two strokes are kind of rare these days. So I kind of feel like if you want, I will go out with you to take a look at the bike because it might be worth looking at. He goes, and he's like, I think at the time really what he was kind of getting at is that maybe he would want to buy it. So I called up Monster and rode out with my friend Two Up on his, I think at the time he had a BMW, it doesn't matter. We rode out to New Jersey and met Monster, not at the house, but in the middle of nowhere cornfield. And we roll up and Monster's outside waiting for me. And we go out, we take a look at the bike. And it was actually a Kawasaki S1 250. So basically it was the little sister of the Mach, of the Kawasaki H2. And sat in it again. I was like, man, this bike is like really cool. So I'm looking at it, and I go and I'm like, all right, give me a second. And I go and I talk to my buddy and I'm like, what do you think? Do you think I should get this bike? He's like, well, if he matches you on what you want, then you should totally get it. So I was like, all right. So I negotiated Monster down and I made him an offer. He was asking $300 for this motorcycle. And I talked him down to $250, which was good because all I had was $300 on me and I really didn't want to spend all my savings on the motorcycle. And now in hindsight, it's like, I can't even believe that I got this bike for this amount of money. So I purchased the bike and I'm like, all right, Monster, I need to figure out a way to get this bike back to New York City. I paid him on good faith and was like, all right, I'm going to come back and get the bike in the future. Now, as I'm leaving, Monster says to me, he goes, it's a good thing you bought that bike. And I was like, why? He's like, the woman I bought it from, she's the only owner of that bike. And I traded her for a wood stove. I traded her this bike for a wood stove. I was like, you traded her? I'm like, so you just made money on this deal? He's like, yeah, I made money on the deal. I was like, damn it. I could have negotiated even less. But he goes, what you're really lucky about, he's like, is that I'm having a party this weekend and we're going to tie this baby up into the trees and set her on fire. And I was like, wow, okay. That is some real redneck. That is a redneck bonfire, good old time to be had. And I am very, 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 very happy that I saved her from being tied up into a tree. Because when I bought her, she was really good looking. And she's 1973, so at this point, she is, how old is she? 50 years old? 51 years old? And I still have her. I still have this motorcycle. So I will fast forward the story into beyond picking up the bike, getting it into the city, and having to do all the things that you need to do in New York, which is to find a place to park it so that it doesn't get stolen and it's not on the street. When I bought the bike, it would start, but it didn't necessarily run very well. And I changed the fluids, figured out how to, through advice from people, how to change the fluids, and then decided to take it on its maiden voyage. Another friend of mine at the time, who I hope to have on the podcast at that point, is my friend Gregor. And Gregor was like, oh, I'm going to go out. I need to get work done on my BMW, so I'm going to go out and see this guy in Brooklyn. And I was like, oh, cool. He's like, so do you want to ride out with me? At that point, I had gotten my license, I had gotten a garage, and I felt like I'm ready to go. Now, one thing that I didn't really think about in buying this motorcycle is that owning a two-stroke in New York City is like also not necessarily the best idea because, again, as I mentioned earlier, you have to wind the bike out to get power on it, and that happens over a certain distance. And in New York City, you have short blocks, and if you keep hitting red lights and you don't get like all the greens, you are going, stopping, which two-strokes do not like that kind of riding. It will follow the plugs, and on top of it, this motorcycle smoked. Part of two-strokes is that they smoke furiously, so it looked like I was on fire, and I was smoking out city blocks by trying to ride it down. So I'm learning how to ride a motorcycle, which just in itself, I'm just trying to figure out. 2, I'm in the city with all this traffic and pedestrians and cabs and psycho drivers. And I'm also, thirdly, trying to figure out how in the world do you even ride a two-stroke? You know, you take the MSF course, and at the time I was, I think what did they have us on? They had us on Nighthawks at the time. So looking back now, I'm like, I don't even know why. Sometimes it's just good not to know what you're getting yourself into. I followed Gregor, and he's like, we're gonna go over the Brooklyn Bridge. And I'm like, oh, okay. So to get into Brooklyn, and you guys have probably seen beautiful photos of the Brooklyn Bridge. If you're not familiar with it in person, it's this old, beautiful bridge. But anywhere that you go in New York City has a lot of traffic. I go to crest the top of the Brooklyn Bridge, and the bike stops working. No power, nothing. And I'm like, oh my God, now what? Now I'm in traffic, the bike dies, and I'm like, I can't leave the bike on the bridge, and I can't just sit here on the bridge. There's traffic lining up behind me, and no one in New York cares. No one in New York cares about you, about your problems. The only thing they want to know is that you get out of their way so they can get to where they need to be. So I conveniently find myself with a long line of cars behind me, honking, people yelling out of their cars as I am now sweating, trying to jump off my bike, not completely panic, and push it off the Brooklyn Bridge. I get it off the bridge, and at the very bottom of the bridge, there was a Jersey barrier with like, I don't know, maybe like 3 feet. And I just put the bike there, and I'm like, oh my God, like I have to leave the bike here. I'm like, Gregor, what do I do? And he's like, well, we'll just leave the bike here, and we'll just go see my guy that I need to go to. Maybe he'll work on your motorcycle. And I was like, okay. But now I'm like, sweating, not in addition to having had to push this bike off the bridge, but also that people steal things in New York City. If it's not tied down, chained, or anything, like, it will just be gone. It's really easy. 2 guys, 3 guys can just pick up a motorcycle, throw it into a van, and see you later. So I had to leave my beautiful new baby at the bottom of the Brooklyn Bridge and head over to this mechanic that Gregor was going to see. Now, this dude was known for being a curmudgeon, and I had never met him before. And we show up, Gregor got what he needed for parts for his bike, and we start talking to the guy, and he looked a lot like Jesse James, the bike builder, but definitely like not as good looking. Like very, very curmudgeon look. He was known for working on BMWs. And I go, okay, so on the way here, my motorcycle broke down. Could I bring it here and could you work on it? And the guy goes to me, well, if you come over and sit on my lap, maybe I'll consider it. And I was like, he did not just say this to me. I was so pissed. Now, Gregor thought it was hilarious. Now, mind you, this guy was also not kidding when he said this to me. And I was like, really? Like, really? Come on, man. Like, come on. And I turned to Gregor. I was like, all right, I'm ready to go. And he's like, I'm like, nope. And in that moment, I made a decision in my motorcycling career, which was this, that I was going to learn how to work on a motorcycle, get this thing running, and make it happen. Because I was not going to be put into that situation ever again by somebody. Fast forward, that $250 quickly doubled, tripled, quadrupled in renting a van to go pick it up, buying parts, which at that time I had a source. The internet was just beginning, so like it had a source trying to like figure out, and there was like a guy who sold Japanese parts, but you had to like call him up on a phone, and when you called him up, you had to ask specifically for what you needed, and then he would put you on hold, go look if you have that part in stock. You'd send him a check, and then he'd send you the parts. It's like, things have come a long way with buying parts and everything that we have available, and how much easier it is to get knowledge to work on things. In general, a two-stroke is pretty easy to work on, except that with older motorcycles, some of the parts are obsolete. And, this bike had things that you don't see, even at that point, were, again, more obsolete, like points, like setting points. That was a tricky one. And since it was two-stroke, it had the oil injector. And, when I took that apart, there was like debris and like big pieces of plastic in that. So like at some point, the bike was probably going to seize. I learned so much working on that bike. But I also quickly realized that it was a terrible decision to buy that as a first motorcycle. And I didn't know any better. And my friends, because they were, weirdo, mega bike guys, were like, yeah, that's going to be a cool bike, like, whatever. And this goes back to it was good that I made the decision like that was a bike that I wanted and I was going to buy, because I was the only one responsible for all that going wrong, right? Had somebody talked me into it, like a boyfriend or a partner, then like I couldn't have been mad at them, right? But I had no excuse to be mad at anybody except for my poor decision and lack of knowledge. Really what it came down to was just lack of knowledge. Like I just didn't know. And that first motorcycle made me learn so quickly about riding, about engines, what the difference was between a two-stroke, a V-twin, a inline-four. Like it was a crash course in just learning everything. And it really got me to asking questions and meeting a lot of people in the motorcycle world, because I had to go out and seek information. And I didn't own all the tools, so I had to borrow things from people. I had to try to work on it on a sidewalk in New York City. I worked on it in my little small space that I had, but then you're realizing you're borrowing tools from people and they're annoyed. And even though I'm really good at returning tools, most people don't. So people were irritated that, you're borrowing tools and they don't know if you're going to give it back. So then you have to start buying tools, and then, it snowballs. And then all of a sudden, 25 years later, you're doing a motorcycle podcast, and this is a part of life. This is all a part of life. But I will never forget that bike. And it is here in this shop, and it's up on the shelf. And I'm going to show you guys that I decided to retire it about 5 years ago and mothball it, because when you have an older motorcycle, that older machines need to be run. And if they aren't consistently used, things dry rot and break apart. Everything needs to be used, whether it's your car, whether it's any of these motorcycles that are in here. These machines need to be used in order to stay functional. And I just wasn't, with everything that I had been able to ride over the past 10 years, I just was riding it less and less and less, because it's a lot of work and it's very underpowered. And at one point I lived at the top of a hill, so trying to get this motorcycle up the hill, it just didn't want to do it. Now it's sitting on the shelf, and It still runs. It has been upgraded and modified. It is definitely showing its age. And I love that in my mind, or knowing that this motorcycle in particular has always been female owned. There's just something kind of special about that. And that makes me feel like if I ever were to pass, which, hopefully doesn't happen for a very long time, that the next owner of this motorcycle will also be female, because it'd just be a nice legacy. And at some point when things change, I really do want to have that motorcycle in my office. I just don't have room right now. But someday in the future, she will be in another place. So I'm glad that I was able to save the motorcycle from being tied up in a tree and set on fire, because she gave me a lot of joy and a lot of knowledge for so many years. You think back, like an inanimate object can change your life so much and also make you learn so much about yourself. So I just love a good story. And I thought that today would be super fun to share with you what my first bike was, how I got it, and that you guys might also be inclined to share how you got your first motorcycles and what it actually is, because that's always the fun part. If you liked and enjoyed this, please like and subscribe. I would truly appreciate it. Share your story in the comments. It's always so fun to try to match the bike to the rider. And as always, ride smart. Ciao.